Kept you waiting, huh? I don't think it's a coincidence that the most popular video on this channel is my review of Armored Core 4 for Answer. And I think the reason why that is that the mecha genre as a whole has been severely underutilized in the gaming landscape. And I'm pretty sure most of you can list off 5 or 10 amazing mecha games out there, but the reality of the situation is that for every one good mecha game, maybe 10 or 20 good first-person or third-person shooters have come out there. The potential of the mecha genre has hardly been touched upon in the gaming sphere as a whole. And let's not kid ourselves here. I've mentioned this before in a previous video, but it bears repeating that a huge reason why there's such a mainstream revitalized interest in Armored Core is based solely off of the studio that's developing the game. FromSoftware, at this moment in time, has such a premium quality to their name that they're the equivalent of Capcom in the 90s and early 2000s. To hate FromSoftware now, you would have to be a contrarian for the sake of being a contrarian. And look, I'm not just trying to nut ride a billion-dollar corporation. I just want to get the point across that we should appreciate good things while we actually presently have them. Because for all we know, in the future, FromSoftware could get bought out by an evil corporation that starts firing key members of staff the same way that Konami did that to Hideo Kojima. But we're not at that point in time. FromSoftware is still good, and there's no Dark Souls pachinko, at least not that I've ever heard of. So how good is Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon? Well, let me tell you, I've beaten this game on over 4 separate occasions. I've seen all the endings, and I've unlocked all the parts. And yes, I too have also racked an uncomfortable amount of hours into this game's online player versus player system. And let me tell you, there's enough subject matter about this game's PvP to make an entire video series on that and that alone, but that's neither here nor there. After spending so much time with the game, I can safely conclude that Armored Core 6 is a good Armored Core game. How it stacks up against other Armored Core games will be relentlessly debated by the fan base. Some people will love the new changes no matter what. Others are gonna hate them no matter what. But in my opinion, after spending so much time with the game, I can safely conclude that FromSoftware has rolled out the red carpet and given Armored Core the same level of premium quality that they usually give to their Soulsborne games. I'm going to make a bold claim here. Armored Core 6 is so good that I believe that FromSoftware has personally revived the mecha genre, at least in a gaming context. And the way they succeeded in doing that was by putting a spotlight on Armored Core's core gameplay loop. And that gameplay loop is all about customizing and creating your own personal mech, seeing how it performs in combat, and then tweaking it accordingly. Over time, the player will end up mastering and creating their own personal death machine. And I'm finally happy to see that this gameplay loop has gone mainstream among Western audiences, and I'm all for whatever the implications mean for the rest of the gaming industry as a whole. But before I get to how or why, it's shameless self-promotion time. Please like, comment, and subscribe to the Gaming Grappler. The more this channel grows, the more time, effort, and dedication I can bring into delivering you guys content on a consistent and regular basis. I just wanted to take a minute to say thank you guys. I have some real successful videos on this channel to the point that people in real life sometimes come up to me and say, wow, that's an amazing video. And it's all thanks to the support I've been getting. With that being said, I hope you enjoy the rest of the show. The story and lore of Armored Core 6 is pretty consistent with the rest of the franchise, despite the fact that Fires of Rubicon takes place in its own separate and distinctive universe. Narrative tropes like corporations being evil and destroying the planet are present not just in AC6, but in pretty much every other Armored Core game before it. The style of how the story is told to the player is also consistent with previous Armored Core entries. Like, for example, at no point do you ever see a human being's face or a pilot's face, no matter how important they are to the story. As far as you know, everybody is just an anonymous looking icon. Like, the most you get is a blurred out sketch of somebody. Aside from that, though, all the dialogue in this game is mostly told through mission briefings and in-game communication logs. And I gotta say, for a FromSoftware game, the dialogue is more heavy than you would expect. Again, for AAA standards, it wouldn't be much, but for a FromSoftware game, there's a lot of content to chew on here. And with that being said, I just want to give you guys a quick synopsis of the story of this game. The setting takes place on Rubicon 3, a planet that humanity has colonized in the far distant future, but is now a post-apocalyptic wasteland, because this is a FromSoftware game and they've been telling only one type of story for the last 20 years. Look, I'm not complaining, I'm just noticing things. This apocalypse was caused by the fires in Ibis, an explosion caused by detonating coral. And just to put things into perspective, this didn't just wipe the entire surface of Rubicon 3 clean, it even spilled out into the rest of the solar system. Coral is not just a fuel source, but it's a conduit for technological advancement. It can even become self-aware and interact with technology. It's pretty much Armored Core 6's big MacGuffin. It's the spice melange to Doom, or the life stream to Final Fantasy, and has a huge impact for the entire plot of this game. 50 years have passed since the fires of Ibis, and Coral has once again resurfaced to the top of Rubicon 3, and it's even taken control of Rubicon's previously automated systems. Now corporations battle each other and fight over Coral as a natural resource, and they do this with the use of armored cores. Yeah, we've finally gotten to the name of the series. An armored core is a giant humanoid robot piloted by an augmented human from within. You play as 4th generation augmented human 621, a mercenary armored core pilot whose main goal is to carve their own path and choose their own destiny throughout the game's story. The way the story was handled in Armored Core 6 addressed a lot of problems and concerns I had in my Armored Core for Answer review. The story this time around is less obtuse and it's easier to follow than most FromSoftware games. Like, it won't be mandatory to go watch a YouTube channel just to explain everything that happened. The plot is laid pretty bare and out in the open, but there's also a lot of innate mysteries in the game that are left open to interpretation, so you might want to go watch those channels anyway. And while you never see a pilot's face in this game, there's so much character dialogue between mission briefings and in-game communication logs that they really do flesh out, and they become human despite the fact that all you're seeing is an icon on the screen. The characters in Fires of Rubicon are fully fleshed out three-dimensional human beings. Like, let's look at Handler Walter, for example. A handler is this game's version of an operator, somebody that hands the player character missions and strategizes for you. And at first glance, Walter is kind of an asshole. He refers to the player character as a dog or a hound. He kind of treats 621 like a mindless killing machine, good for making money and nothing else. But as we play Armored Core 6, Walter's backstory is slowly drip-fed to the player. And we find out that he has his own hidden agenda and his own moral and ethical code that he follows to a T. And in his own way, he's actually looking out for 621. And the game kind of exists in a morally gray area. Almost every ending can kind of be justified in its own regard, and that's pretty unique. Handler Walter is not an anomaly in Armored Core 6. Plenty of other characters are just as fleshed out and fully developed. Like, let's look at fan favorite Rusty. Rusty is one of the best pilots in the game and one of the few people that treats 621 with dignity and respect. And he also has his own hidden agenda and backstory. Or take a look at G1 Michigan. At first glance, Michigan comes off as this cartoonish drill sergeant, but as we play the game, we find out that he actually gives a shit about the men who work under them. He knows them by a name-by-name basis, and he wants them all to survive at the end of the day, even if he dies fighting for them. He also has a respected admiration for the player. Even characters that come off as silly are actually more layered than you would think. Armored Core 6 doesn't just have good character development, it also tells its story pretty well through its environment, which is pretty ironic. You know, when I reviewed Armored Core for Answer, I was mocked relentlessly for daring to suggest that the way it handled environmental storytelling was bad. A lot of people argued that the game takes place in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. What would you honestly expect to be there? But Armored Core 6 shows that you can actually still have good environmental storytelling in spite of that premise. And let's be honest here, I think that Armored Core for Answer is a very good game, but the backgrounds in the environment were very mediocre. Like, they were pretty bland, and all the 3D models looked like they were dragged and dropped from the Unity asset store. Fires of Rubicon has the player explore the ruins of a once great civilization. The player character will come across various gigantic coral mining outposts. Ruined spaceships have now been repurposed as bases for corporations and gangs that still roam the planet. There's also a great moment, you might want to skip this part in the video, where the player travels deep underground and they find a hidden city that was at one point the crown jewel of Rubicon. And in that city, I had the same kind of reaction as when I saw Ash Lake for the first time. FromSoftware really rolled out the red carpet this time around. You can also find hidden logs and item descriptions, and while everything I just said isn't quite on the level of Dark Souls or Elden Ring, it's very good and very premium for Armored Core standards, and it did a lot to get me invested in the lore and backstory of this world. There are also a lot of cinematic moments in this game that I didn't honestly see coming. There are some escape sequences that look like they came right out of a Metroid game, and some boss fights where FromSoftware rolled the red carpet out and treated like something out of Metal Gear Rising. Like, the presentation for this game is just absurdly good for Armored Core standards. Gameplay is not just the most important aspect of any FromSoftware game, but gaming as a whole in general. And the difficulty of Fires of Rubicon has been widely disputed amongst the fan base. Some people argue the game is too difficult, others say it's way too easy. And that wide discrepancy doesn't really surprise me. After all, your combat is going to be as easy or as difficult as you're able to master the in-game customization settings. I'm going to tackle the combat and mobility options first because it'll give greater context as to what the customization options are even affecting. In AC6, you play as a mech pilot, and a mech can move in 3 dimensions. And what that means is that you're not limited to the ground. You could take the fight to the skies, but your only limitations are the boost meter. The boost meter is like stamina. It'll allow the player to fly, to dodge, and to assault boost. Assault boosting is a carryover from Armored Core 4 and For Answer. It allows the player to rocket towards enemies at max speed, and in this game, it's very generous. It doesn't waste much meter at all, and there's pretty much no reason to never use it no matter which build you're using. The player has 4 weapons that can be fired simultaneously. You have 2 weapons for the arm units and 2 for the shoulders. You can also drop weapons, which will lower your equip burden and allow the player to move faster in combat. Melee is the most powerful option in the game, but also the most risky. Your melee options are also pretty limited this time around. You can only carry 2 melee weapons at a time, and they can only be used on your left arm unit. Manual aiming, on the other hand, is less important in Armored Core as it isn't, let's say, a first-person shooter. And the reason why is that aiming is handled with an automated RPG-like system that still has depth to it. I'm going to go in more greater detail when I get into the customization portion of this review, but to get the general gist of it, depending on what targeting system you have equipped will decide the effective range of your weapons. Also, weapons themselves have a recommended range, so you're going to want to choose a targeting system based on your weapon loadout. If I were to sum up the gameplay loop for combat in Armored Core, I would say it's about managing your boost meter properly to get in your mech's proper range to make the best use out of your weapons. That's a lot more complicated than it sounds. The player has to know their spacing and how to time their weapons properly in that spacing. Let's also not neglect the fact that firing 4 weapons simultaneously requires a bit of mechanical dexterity. Like, all weapons could interact completely differently. Like, you could have a charged weapon in one hand and a melee on the other. You might want to switch to a shotgun mounted on your left shoulder unit while using missiles on your right side. And all of those things interacting might cross the wires in your head if you're unfamiliar with that playstyle. You also have to juggle the fact that Armored Core 6 has a stagger system which is completely unique to this game alone. And basically how it works is that every weapon in the game deals a specific type of damage. And once that damage stacks up and the meter reaches its peak, the player or the enemy will be stunned, where they'll be more vulnerable to damage types. And that pretty much covers the basics about how combat works in Armored Core 6. You might be wondering though, how fast does this game compare to Armored Core For Answer? Armored Core 6 is a very fast game, but it's not in the same ballpark as Armored Core for Answer. For Answer has crazy quick boost chaining maneuvers, and you can stay in the sky pretty much indefinitely, and mastery of that game looks ludicrously fast. Like, high level for Answer gameplay can look nauseating to the untrained eye, and I'm saying that as somebody that loves that game. But again, Armored Core 6 is fast, but it's not that fast. All right, here are where things start getting complicated, because the mech building sim aspects to AC6 have not been streamlined in the slightest. And my main goal here is not to give you guys a comprehensive guide, but just to communicate how much depth there is to the system and the effects that will have on the combat in turn. To simplify things, there are 3 different weight classes of mechs you can build. Lightweight builds give the player the best movement options and the fastest speed. The only downside is that they stagger easy, they don't take much damage, and they can't carry the biggest weapons. This is the glass cannon archetype of this game. Heavyweights, on the other hand, are the exact opposite of lightweights. They're slower, they're more tanky, they have the most HP, they don't have good mobility options, but they can carry the biggest and strongest weapons. Medium weight builds are a nice balance between the 2 other weight classes. While they don't specialize in any one area, that jack of all trades mentality is pretty useful for your single player campaign where resources are limited and you want to try a little bit of every weapon you have in your arsenal. Now, what I find ironic here is that Armored Core gets its namesake from the fact that the developers intended the player to build their mech around the core unit, but the reality of the situation is it makes more sense for the player to build their mech around the leg units. Leg units dictate your overall equip burden and your mobility options. That's right, it would make more sense to call it Armored Core Armored Quads. There are several different types of leg parts in this game. The most common one are bipedal legs, and while they're nothing special, they look the coolest, so most players end up using them. Reverse joint legs allow the player to jump high in the air without wasting boost meter, and they give the player a powerful kick move. And I'm not going to sugarcoat this next part, but tetrapods are very powerful in this game. While they're intended to be used for the player to hover in the air to take advantage of certain weapon types, they also allow the player to carry a heavy equip burden without too much of a negative impact on their overall mobility. As if that wasn't enough, even after the patch, they still have one of the most powerful kick moves in the game. Tank parts are also pretty interesting. They allow the player to carry the biggest and strongest weapons while having decent mobility on the ground. The only downside to this is obviously the fact that tanks don't do so well in 3-dimensional combat. They can't fly good, and they have problems with enemies that take to the skies. However, there's also a tank class that can hover in the air. I think it's pretty powerful, but to be honest, I'm not a big fan of those types of builds because I love my mobility. There's also a fair amount of depth that goes into picking out your arm parts, because even if your mech is big and has a huge carrying capacity, certain arms can't use certain types of weapons. Like, you can't use giant Gatling guns if you have little T-Rex arms. And in addition to that, arm parts also affect your firing accuracy, how much recoil will affect your mech, and your melee damage. So there's a lot to consider when picking out an arm part. Core parts are also pretty important. They have a huge impact on your mech's overall defensive stats, but in addition to that, your core will also have an effect on what type of generators or boosters you're going to put inside your robot. And I'm going to be honest here, head parts are probably the least important aspect about building your mech, and I honestly just pick whatever one looks the coolest because I'm a style over substance kind of guy. On the other hand, your weapon loadout matters a lot. Like, it is debatably as important or more important than selecting your leg type first, because different guns or melee weapons will affect different gameplay styles. Like, for example, machine guns and pistols work best at a mid to close range, so you'll have to design a mech around fighting in that type of spacing. There are also other different classes of weapons like sniper rifles or laser guns that work best at a distance and can also be charged. You also have your shotguns, which, like in typical video game fashion, are overpowered in close range combat. There are also passive abilities you could put on your shoulder units like auto turrets or missiles, or energy-based weapons that need a specific type of generator to work effectively. All weapons work best at different type of ranges and need a specific targeting system. Your targeting system is one of your mech's 3 internal units, and it has a huge effect on combat. It's going to dictate what type of range your mech fights best at. Like, certain targeting systems are built more for close to mid-range, others from a distance. Other targeting systems aren't good at any range, but make your missiles fire more accurately and faster. Your targeting system is going to affect your loadout. Like, you don't want to use a long-range based system for a shotgun-based build. You won't be able to hit anything at a close range. The next internal part for your mech is the generator, and it's one of the most complicated aspects for your build. Your generator will decide the capacity of your boost meter and the style in which it recovers. Some generators will have a huge capacity but recover slowly. Other generators recover quickly but don't have a huge capacity, and some fall somewhere in between. As if that wasn't complicated enough, your generator also has a huge impact on your mech's overall energy load. In addition to an equip burden, every part of your mech and certain weapons take a certain amount of energy in order to operate. If you don't have a generator that can support that, you won't be able to even use your mech on missions, even though you can use your mech if it's overburdened. The booster is the final internal part to your mech. And when you think booster, think mobility. Your booster will decide every minute detail to how your mech moves, down to your base speed, how often you can quick boost, how far you can quick boost, how your assault boost can work, even down to the details of how your mech ascends and descends into the air. It's a pretty important part for building your mech. All right, I think I briefly went over every aspect about customizing your mech, but to be honest with you, it doesn't really do the process justice. The main point I'm trying to get across here, though, is that this is half of the game. Half of Armored Core is about staying in the garage and looking at spreadsheets and crunching numbers to figure out what part works effectively with your mech and how your build should operate. If you're not the type of person that enjoys building things and customizing them to your own personal taste, I don't know if you'll enjoy this game. While the gameplay is good, it's meant to go hand in hand with the customization options. If you want a fast-paced third-person action shooter, you're only half covered here. You're half covered because you're gonna have to get over the wall of complexity that is this game's customization options. But if you are the type of person that does enjoy building and customizing things, you're gonna be in for a treat here, because Armored Core 6, like plenty of other Armored Core games that have come out before it, has one of the most in-depth and complicated cosmetic options I have ever seen. Like, even for Armored Core standards, you could change every color to every part of your mech, and the image editor has never been better. Like, you could pretty much create anything with this thing and then copy and paste it to your mech. Okay, so my first problem is more of a minor nitpick. Like, it didn't overall ruin my experience of the game, so please don't fire me into orbit for saying this, but I found that resources were overly limited during my first playthrough, which is a big problem because that first playthrough is the longest playthrough. And during that time, parts were so expensive that I only had enough money to run maybe 2 or 3 Armored Cores at a time with a limited amount of loadouts. And it's a real shame because I find that Armored Core is at its best when it allows the player plenty of opportunities to experiment with different forms of gameplay. So again, I consider this a minor nitpick because there are plenty of workarounds to this problem. The first one is less than ideal. You can replay previous missions and grind up as much money as you want, but that's not something you're going to want to do during your first playthrough of the game. Another solution is that you can buy and resell all your parts at full price, meaning you kind of have a way of experimenting with whatever you want in the game. There's also this nice quality of life improvement where you can save a certain loadout, and if you don't have the parts available, the game will just automatically buy them back for you, which is a nice feature. But for me personally, I would have just liked more resources at a hand, especially during my first run of the game. My next biggest problem isn't even unique to Armored Core. It's a problem I have with a lot of games this generation. And it's the overly simplistic, minimalistic heads-up display. The HUD in Armored Core 6 is terrible. I don't know what happened this generation. I'm guessing developers just like the minimalistic visual design, or maybe they think that the average gamer has a 4K setup with the best settings imaginable, so they can do whatever they want for the heads-up display, but this minimalistic style is especially egregious for Armored Core. The heads-up display in Armored Core 6 is mostly comprised of thin gray lines that are borderline translucent, and at first glance, it looks serviceable, like it has all the information the player needs to see. You've got a health bar, the boss's health bar, the stagger meter. The bottom right-hand corner of the screen shows your weapons and how much ammo they have. And the aiming reticle is also pretty useful. It shows all 4 weapons and their various cooldown meters and reload times. The problem is, in Armored Core 6's fast-paced gameplay, all of these menus kind of blend together. It doesn't convey enough visual information to the player effectively. Fast-paced gameplay in Armored Core 6 could have the player quick boosting around the stage in 3 dimensions while they're fighting multiple enemies at once, or maybe a difficult boss fight that teleports around the stage like some kind of anime character. While all that's happening, like maybe a volley, an Itano circus of missiles is exploding in a multitude of colors, and while all that is happening, zoning in and focusing in on these thin gray lines to see what weapon needs to be recharged, what weapon needs to be reloaded, what's going on a cooldown, what's happening. All of that is incredibly difficult. Like, it hurts my eyeballs to look at this thing most of the time. Even your ammo counter at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen is in like the tiniest font imaginable. I don't know why they did this. I don't think this is a nitpick. I think this is a huge oversight on behalf of the developers. Like, Armored Core is a series known for its customization, and the idea that you wouldn't be able to customize the heads-up display seems like a huge missed opportunity here, especially since other games like Armored Core Last Raven really allowed the player to personalize and customize every aspect for the in-game heads-up display. Look, I know this might not be a problem for everyone. Like, maybe some people love the minimalistic menu. Maybe people don't have a problem keeping track of everything in gameplay, but you have to at least agree that it's a huge misstep for the developers not to have this as a customizable feature. Pretty much everything I love about Armored Core 6 is based on this game's single-player combat. The enemy design has a lot of variety. You have your typical cannon fodder type of enemies that die pretty easily. It kind of just exists to give the player a power fantasy type of high, but as you play your way through the campaign, you'll come across more challenging and more difficult enemy types that are going to test the quality of your build. Like the PCA's light cavalry and heavy cavalry units are pretty challenging to defeat and require a certain strategy and a certain build to fight them. But at the end of the day, the thing that really carries Armored Core 6 is the phenomenal boss fights. And I gotta say, one of the reasons why I was so excited to play this game was that I was hoping that FromSoftware could take all the lessons they learned over the years of making games like Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring, and then apply it to Armored Core. And man, they over-delivered in that regard. Now, that isn't to say that AC6 just completely plagiarizes the Souls genre, but there are some similarities. The fights have a same sort of rhythm and cadence. The player has to manage a boost meter, which is pretty similar to a stamina bar. You have to know when to heal and when not to heal, and you have to figure out when to time your staggered hits in. The key difference here is that you're doing this all with Armored Core's core gameplay mechanics. The player can move in 3-dimensional space. You're not limited to fighting on the ground. You're using primarily ranged weapons, and you don't have invincibility frames. You also have to take into account that at any point, the player can customize a mech specifically for defeating a certain boss. And I would consider this the in-game easy mode. Like, if I made a heavyweight mech with dual stun needles, I could pretty much delete most bosses' health bars. But if I want to play the game on a harder difficulty challenging mode, I'll use a lightweight build and fight the game like I'm some sort of anime character. So overall, the game has a pretty interesting approach to boss design. All my favorite boss fights in this game are all the fast-paced ones. Bosses like the Ibis mech, which looks like it was directly inspired by End of Evangelion. I mean, it's just pretty blatantly obvious at that point. And all of the late game and end game bosses were all pretty cool, especially the fight against Rusty, which looked like it came right out of Metal Gear Rising.
Here we are, buddy. I was right all along. You were just another threat to Rubicon. Combined mind of corporations, I couldn't stop you. This new
So how good is Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon? It's a good game. It does suffer from some problems, like some boss fights have an unrealistic difficulty spike for no real reason, and it's incredibly easy to cheese a broken build once you fully understand the game's customization options. But if anything, one thing that FromSoftware successfully did here is that they've popularized and mainstreamed the mecha genre in a gaming context. The gameplay loop for this genre is about customizing your own mech, seeing how it performs in combat, and tweaking it accordingly, and personalizing it. And if you go on YouTube right now or check the internet as a whole or go into gaming forums, you'll notice that the gaming community as a whole has taken to this concept like moths to a flame. There are entire YouTube channels dedicated to showing off player versus player builds specifically designed for the single player campaign, and even builds that maybe don't function well but are pretty cool and specific to a certain player's tastes. The proof is in the pudding. These videos, these channels are extremely popular right now, to the degree that I wouldn't be surprised if other developers start mimicking the FromSoft formula, but this time for Armored Core. So in that regard, I can safely say that FromSoftware has successfully revived the mecha genre.